name's Rob. First thing we're going to do is go through steps 1 through 5 on the setup steps. You can get there from the home screen using this web link. Once you've logged in, you should have already done 1 and gone through 4. And the system setup is setup, system setup, where you're changing your company name, address, pickup location would be one of these addresses. You can just leave it blank if it's going to be the billing. Your phone numbers, email addresses, taglines, etc., and your logo. Now these are the main options for here. If we save that, and the next thing we'll want to set up while we're in here is the email options. This is really how do you want to send emails through the system. By default, this is being sent through Outlook. This would pop open Outlook and put your emails in the Outlook outbox to be sent through it when this is set. You can change this to control it through an internal mail server where you're setting up your mail identification. This would be similar to the settings you use in Outlook to send email. You have a couple of other options. If you're sending it directly, you may want to send a copy back to yourself. And that would just automatically send a copy back to yourself. Now these can be altered by employee and by individual. We'll talk about that here shortly as well. So you may have, for most shops, work in Outlook, but for people in production, they don't have Outlook. They're sharing a computer. They set up to send theirs internally. Next thing I want to talk about is the employee setup. So if I go to Setup, Employee Setup, you'll notice a number of different employees in the system. The one that defaults is the store owner. You can, of course, clone any one of these. So if I clone it, let's say it's Joed. You can create new groups, and that's your new subgroups. If you want to change it, their position, their department they're in, their email address. Now this will be their return email address by default, and what prints on if it's a salesperson. Their phone numbers, if different, you can say it's a different cell number, different business line than the default. If you leave them blank by default, it will come from whatever you set the company record for. Use of the system, basically do they show up on salespeople's list or not? Whether their status of employment, hire date, termination date. Now this is really optional information, similar to their personal information and signature and images. That's kind of whether you want to fill that in or not to track that internally. And then we'll get more into pricing levels and quick products when we get into the product setup and how those work. Alright, when creating a new product, it wants to know whether you want to let them clock in and out of the system. We're going to say yes here, and it's going to pull up this particular value. Now, it wants to know how we're logged in. Now, this is the password that you originally created, because what it'll show up for you is owner, because that's how you'll be logged in. And so it's the original password, just as hell to be able to change this for different employees. Now it's going to want to default to first initial last name as their login, and you can set a password at this point for them. Now you can set all your employees to the same password at this point if you would like, and they can control it later. So once I've set up a password, it wants to know, can they log into the system? Do we want to reset the password on their next login? If I'm setting up all the employees with the same password, then I'm going to tell them the first time they log in, it'll ask them to change their password to something they can remember. It does require a password change fairly often based on the security of the system. Then it wants to know their security template. These are security rights throughout the system that you have. We'll get into this more as well in later coursework. But for now, if it's someone that's going to be helping you set up the system, make them an administrator. We can change back later to what their actual use once you go live. These others are set to not allow or allow for certain things, meaning a standard generally can't look at your financial information, nor can they get in and affect anything in your financial area. And of course, while you're setting up the system, you're going to need rights to be able to do some of those. generally you'd set it up as administrator. If you're using production terminal, this is basically the web-based terminal for production. It wants to know, can they log into that, and whether they're a standard or administrator user for production terminal. And there it won't really matter as much whether they're standard administrators. Not as much setup to be done directly in it. It's more what can they see. Now we've created another employee for Joe Ed. He can log in as Joe Ed and has security rights of administrator. And again, you can change their category, clone, add new ones, etc. for all your employees that you need. Next thing I want to talk about is the accounting as far as taxes are concerned. We'll get more into accounting later on as close to you go live. From there, I go to Setup, Accounting Setup, Chart of Accounts. Taxes are generally liabilities, so under sales tax liabilities we have our different taxable accounts. You're going to set up a different taxable account unless you're using the tax software that pulls the taxes online. You're going to set up for each type of tax that you receive. In this case, I receive a state tax as well as a county tax. State tax is 7% and a county tax of 1.75. Now if I do installations in different counties and need to track different counties different from state, then this is my county. I may create another one for a different county. Again, you can just call them, and in Louisiana they call them parishes. And so in this case, for this particular parish, it wants to know the tax rate, and if there's a cap, always round up. And then this would be your information for the reporting of who you pay these taxes to. So now that I have a St. Tammany parish and your county, and you can set up the ones you want, the next thing we're going to need to do is look at the tax classes. Currently for my location, it is pulling in and combining the county and the state tax. Now I can say no, I'm going to clone this and create one called St. Tammany Parish, and then St. Tammany Parish is going to have the state and that county tax, and therefore it will track them separately. May or may not be different rates, as well as tracking what you owe separately to the different clients. Now saving that, you'll see I now have St. Tammany Parish. My location is still set as the default, so when I add a new client, it's going to default to this tax class. You can change that by hitting what you want and set as default. At this point, any new customer I add, it's going to default their taxes to St. Tammany Parish unless changed. Now some clients can be set up as non-taxable, and that's where some of these other ones come from. Some nonprofit would be tax exempt, doesn't exempt. Some may be tax exempt from your local but not your state, or vice versa, and that could also be set up to where maybe nonprofit is only taxable from state but still owes county. Then I could say they are not tax exempt from St. Tammany or from any other taxes. And those are tax classes that you've built out of the taxability accounts. The next option in taxability is Taxability Codes. These are actually what applies to specific types of products, meaning in a number of areas my sign or my print is taxable, but the installation, because it is considered service, is not. So therefore within one order you may have some line items that are taxable and some that aren't. So this definition by particular product. Goods, of course, is what most of your products will be. And in looking at it from here, it's going to show you all the different products in control that are currently tied to that taxability code. Where service may not be taxable, or it may just be taxable on certain items, and these are the items in the system that are using that taxability code. If installation or other services are fully taxable in your area, you will want to go and say this product is fully taxable as well. And that way it's tracking installation as being taxable. And those are the three components that make up the different tax classes and tax codes. Can you do estimates through production terminal is one of my questions, and no, you cannot. Production terminal is really just used for flowing things through production that are already created. Next thing I want to talk about are the products in the system and selecting the products. If we go to pricing, setup, adjust product information, and we're getting into step 4. This is going to list out all of the products that are currently in the system. From here, what you'll want to do is go through each one, and I'll kind of run through them now to let you know what each one means. Because some of you will and won't need, and sometimes how they're labeled may be a little confusing. Alright, I've already made some of these inactive, so I'm turning back on. So basically, under artwork and design, color retouch is a part of photography. Most people won't use it unless you are billing for more of your professional photography, photo booth type stuff. Design, everyone uses. Billboard lease is if you are leasing out billboards. You own and lease billboards. Composition and architectural sign is usually for interior architectural, like ADA, often used with photopolymers and other type substrates and braille. It really combines all of the other products. So composition architectural signage includes cut vinyl signs, digital prints, dimensional signs, and wraps them into one product where you're doing layers. It is a more advanced product. I don't recommend you start there, because as you set up other products, it will automatically be setting up this product as the components are built. If you do type of ADA interior engraving type routing stuff, we can leave that one on. Cut vinyl signs, cut vinyl banners, signs, most people will leave these on. The other ones you may not is cut vinyl ready banners. Those are when you buy pre-cut, pre-hemmed, grommeted banners just to put vinyl on, compared to buying banner material in a roll. The other's RTA is our terminology for ready to apply. Those are letters that are going to be put on windows or other things, not directly onto a substrate. Next thing is digital printing. There's a number of different ones in here. Again, digital banners is one I created, so it wouldn't be in their data set yet. We'll get into discussing how to create such things. Wide format prints is everything printed off of a roll-to-roll printer, wrapped into wide format prints. Once we've set up wide format prints, you can then split it out if you want to create separate products, such as digital banner, even though they're really the same product with just default setup. Your system will start with wide format. Small format is copies, digital copies, smaller digital type printing. Mounting is mounting printed goods to a substrate. Grand format printing is billboard printing. Billboard, very wide format. Flatbed print for your flatbed printers. Edge print, this is referred to as the Gerber edge, or a printer that is using a ribbon rather than inkjet or other forms of printing. Die sub printer, where you're die subbing it and then doing a transfer onto fabric. And those are your different prints you may or may not want to use. Now, dimensional signs, think about dimensional signs as an unprinted sign, something you are cutting out. So it might be dimensional letters, it might be a dimensional sign. Often people who do these are often on a CNC type router, is generally to create the dimensional signs, dimensional letters. You also have engraving and sandblasting, and engraving is also used for three-dimensional routing. Displays, do you do display rentals? These are generally trade show type displays. Do you sell trade show displays, and do you rent trade show displays? Electric signs, channel letters and logos, sign cabinets. If you're creating these, I would leave them on for now. Same with pylons, if you're creating large pylons. Neon, if you're producing neon in-house. The other ones you may want to leave on or may want to look at, whether you're doing electric or not, is this custom fabricated sign that allows you to build anything part by part. If you don't do electric at all, you probably don't need any of these. That's one you may consider your point person may lead you to if you have a particular purpose for it. Most miscellaneous you're going to need is just the standard miscellaneous. If you're doing die cutting, this is not plotting, this is physical die sub, you'll need that as well. And then we have our miscellaneous. Now when we get into outsourced goods, most of our outsourcing is done through a miscellaneous type product. Meaning these miscellaneous samples, the reason they're in here is so that you can clone them and create things for outsourcing. So if I want outsource a list of baseball caps, and my vendor gives me a price list for different caps. Well, you can create that out of these like price list samples or dynamic list where it's physically pulling parts, samples. And again, we'll get into that as well as with your point persons for exactly what your needs are. Now again, if it's just an outsourced item, you may just, and you're calling to get a quote, you're generally just going to type it in as miscellaneous or outsourced item and type in a price. Offset printing. Pretty straightforward. If you do or don't do offset printing on the offset presses, you can just remove that. Outsourcing. Outsourced product is very similar to miscellaneous, really almost the identical product. It's just punching in and typing in a price and giving it a name. You can rename these products later, get into that as far as if you don't like the wording, outsourced, that can be changed. Photography. Again, this is generally if you're doing professional photography work. Post frames and hardware, most people will keep these up. Most people sell post, frames, stakes, or some form of finishing hardware. Printed electronics, this is really only if you're doing membrane switches at this point for screen print companies. Process prints is really very similar to architectural. It's just used by the startup person to achieve particular products. Meaning, if I printed specifically to bottles, and then I needed my bottles, I needed my caps, I needed these other components, this is really used as a advanced function or advanced product to be turned into other needs. I would leave it off for now unless directed to do so differently. Raw goods sales. These are often used with reprographics type clients where they're selling paper and they're selling inks and maybe even leasing equipment out. These are the products used for that, both the equipment lease, equipment sales, and then material sales. Reprographics, again, mainly architect drawings, things of that nature, are set up slightly different. Screen printing. Now, if you don't do screen printing, you definitely don't need the screen print product. Screen print table can be set up if you do outsource screen printing and they give you screen print a table for their pricing on screen printing. Then you could set up your outsourced screen print product within the table product to give you accurate pricing within the system. This one is for just manufacturing the prints yourself. Service and installation and warranty, this just depends on what you do. There's a lot of different ones in here, like there's vehicle graphic installation. If you don't do vehicle graphics installation, remove it. Same with electrical and billboard service. Pretty much everyone needs to ship and deliver, so that's all going to stay there. System's going to stay there, really nothing in it. Promotion. Textiles. If you're doing textiles, meaning printing to t-shirts, hats, caps, things like that, then you'll need the textile product, and then these are all the different components that you can do to textile, meaning if I don't direct print to my textile, you can remove that and leave the others that what processes you do on that textile separately. And last but not least is the vehicle wraps. For now, if you do vehicle wraps, I would leave them all on. But there are significant differences between the three, and when you play around with it, you may end up turning one or two off. But I would get comfortable with find out what you want to use the most of. The main difference is vehicle wrap looks at an individual side of a vehicle for its dimensions, where detail panel looks at 4 different sizes or up to 4 different sizes per side of a vehicle to give you dimensions. So basically looking at a side as a single entity or each panel separately on that side. Quick quote is just a quick way to enter things. It's not as detailed as far as costing is concerned, but sometimes easier for your employees to just throw in a quick order when they're not certain. And then window perf, of course, is the window perf that goes on to any of the above vehicle types. Okay, so now that we've checked and unchecked the ones we want, and once we've done that, we'll go ahead and hit save on the right. We edited it and then saved it. You can cascade all of these parts, meaning if I uncheck billboard lease, most products in here have parts associated with them, meaning, for my digital prints, I need my roll stock materials, my roll stock prints, etc. You can turn off all the parts to all the products that you've turned off in the system and make them inactive all at once. To do that, you go to Tools, Utilities, Cascade Product Relationships. This will run a query that looks at everything you unchecked and then goes find the parts to those and inactivates them as well. Now it is triggered to where if I have the same part, meaning Coroplast, could be used on vinyl signs, could be used on digital prints, could be used everywhere. It will only inactivate it when it is removed from every part. Remove that and ran the query. Alright, now let's talk about the parts that belong to these. If I go to Setup, Pricing Setup, Adjust Part Information Setup. Now in the Price Adjust Part Information Setup, it is listed down the left side of how you want to set the parts up, cost-based or area-based. I'm going to start my conversations all with cost-based because a lot of companies, even though they may be pricing on area-based, they still want to get their cost out of the system. So if I go to cost-based, under my list of products at the bottom, if I go to digital prints, wide format prints, it will list all the product categories or part categories that belong within this product. So under wide format prints, you'll notice we have our roll stock materials, and it's going to list out all of our roll stock materials in the system. So under roll stock, if we look across the top of it, we have our different materials, and each one is in its own category. So if I want to create a new material, you're generally going to clone one that's the closest to it. So in this case, if I wanted a different digital banner material, I would just clone this digital banner and call it 13 ounce or whatever it's going to be. And once I've created a new product, a new part, it will add it into this list, and you can edit it from hitting the edit on the right hand side. The first thing it needs to know is your cost per linear foot. This is not a square foot cost, this is how much it costs coming off the roll. In utilization and costing, it does not use material on a square foot basis as far as printed material is concerned. It uses it off of a linear foot because that's how it comes off the printer. It assumes you will not cut out a piece off the scrap off the top and stick it back into the printer to print something else, at least not in its cost. And so in this particular, what's our cost per linear foot? Whatever it may be. Then we're going to get into the multipliers we will get into in another session. This is to come up with a retail price. Then we get into our substrate roll width and roll length. It's a 42-inch roll and it's 150 feet long. The cutting speeds I would ignore for now. Now, why I say ignore them for now is because generally all of your roll materials are going to cut at the same speed. So until we have some tests, it's going to run yourself nuts trying to figure out one material over another. Let's run some tests, figure out what it's going to be, and then you'll change them all at the same time. Now, when we get into flat stock materials, that isn't necessarily the case because aluminum does take much longer to cut than coroplast. But as far as the rolls, it wants to know by machine or by hand. And if it's, again, all these will be one, but in a flat stock material it may take multiple passes to cut through it. Once we have the material basics in, it wants to know where do we use this material, meaning do we apply cut vinyl to it, do we print directly to it, do we use it in grand format printing, and do we use it in screen printing. Now applying cut vinyl means exactly that. In the cut vinyl banner product, this material will show up. Direct print means it shows up when we're going to print directly to a roll good. Mounting, which isn't here, it would be in flat stock materials, has the same option, a flatbed printer, you're printing directly to it, but you could also be mounting it. Now again, you can clone these items from here and just create new ones. The details on any part, if I go to the open button, it will actually bring you into the details for a given part. And this would be the same as going to setup, pricing setup, all pricing setup, part setup, scrolling down, finding that particular part. Just easier if you're in adjust part information, just to pop it open. So looking at this under digital vinyl roll, you'll see we have some black fields and red fields. Red fields are all dealing with area-based pricing and can be ignored, and we'll get into those when we get into area-based pricing. Other than that, you have the same fields on this screen as you do on the adjust part information screen. This is just done in a spreadsheet format, so I can go in and change them all at one time rather than having to do an edit, save, edit, save, edit, save for each particular component that you're updating. Alright, next part of our puzzle is equipment. So if I look at our printers here, this is a listing of all the sample printers we have in the system. The first thing you're going to want to do is remove anything that's not even close. Now, if your specific printer isn't in the system, I would leave one that is the closest to it how it is. So, and you'll just do that by unchecking a number of the printers, whichever ones you're not using. So I'm going to save that. And you'll notice up at the top you have an option to look at all of them, to look at active or inactive only. A lot of the materials, like when we were looking at those roll materials, those were the active materials we were looking at. There's actually a lot of different materials in the system already. You just need to turn them on if you want to look at them. Now, so looking at the printers that are left, first thing it wants to know is your cost per hour for the printer. This is not labor. This is solely just for the printer itself. Now, in our web browser, where we are now is going into step 5. Right. In step 5, there's some optional spreadsheets. One is figuring out equipment cost and one is figuring out labor burden rates. I recommend you kind of take a look at those and go through them as well, and it just breaks down how we came about getting some of these equipment costs. And it's generally lease or depreciation divided by the hours you use it, plus maintenance, etc. Alright, then it wants to know for this printer, what is it? Is it a roll stock printer? Is it a grand format printer? Is it a flat stock printer? It may be both. You may have printers that are both a flat stock printer and will print roll to roll. Okay. On a roll to roll, the print margin leader is the material it takes to load the printer. So to load my Maki, it's thinking I need 10 inches of wasted material to feed the printer before I can start printing. Trailer is the material that comes out the back before you can cut it off. The margin top and bottom is the space on top that needed for the roller, so therefore it can't print. Meaning even though I may be printing 54-inch material, I'm only can really print 53 inches wide because I have a half-inch margin on the top and a half-inch margin on the bottom based off of this printer. Then it just wants to know the max material width that can fit on the printer, and then we get into resolutions and speeds. Now looking at this, we have 4 different resolution settings and then 4 additional settings for alternate types of ink. So in this case, I have my lowest start. You always want to start with your fastest, worst quality and go up to the best. So in this case, I have 320 by 320 that prints at 320 square feet an hour. That's my low res. And my ink multiplier is 90%. What I mean by that, if I scroll to the right, you'll see an ink cost. Okay, this is my ink cost per foot at 100%. Well, if I'm printing at 320 by 320, I'm actually not using as much ink as I normally would need to, so it's charging only for 90% of that ink rather than 100% of that ink of what it's doing at the higher resolution. Now when I get into even higher resolutions, like a double strike 720, my print speed of course is slower and I'm using more ink by percentage to cover that double strike. And then your 4th resolution, again, what's the next highest, print speed and multiplier. Then it wants to know a setup time. This is to load your printer. A labor percentage. Now, by default, most labors come from the equipment that they're using, meaning when this printer is running, it's also tracking that amount of time for labor. However, if you have one employee running 3 different printers, I don't necessarily need to associate 100% of the print time to labor. So in that case, I may say, only, he's running 2 printers, so I'm going to only say 70%. And that way, if, or 75%. And that way, if it was an hour worth of print time, it would account 45 minutes worth of labor. Your ink cost, your application tape cost, in case you're adding application tape or masking tape. Then we get into an alternate print mode. This is really based off of if your printer prints white or prints a clear coat or prints something else that's outside the normal printing range. So in this case, it may print white ink, and then it wants to know, okay, so what's the speed when I'm printing white ink compared to when it wasn't? And same forth with the different resolutions, because you've got to add for the white ink, as well as what is my ink cost for it when I'm adding white ink compared to when I'm not adding white ink. Now, if this is a dye sublimation printer, you can also set up a few other variables. You can set up if it's a dye sub printer, you can set up the default press that it goes to transfer it. You can set up the default transfer paper that it uses, as well as if you use block out, the default material for that. And that's just to set it up so you don't have to choose these things every time in a dye sub that are used on a regular basis. Now, keeping it simple, it's just equipment and material. Let's go take a look at what this looks like in an estimate. If I go to digital prints, wide format prints, here let's say I want 10, 18 by 24 inch prints, print it on the Mamaki, on vinyl. Try to keep it simple for now. Alright. Didn't want to do a die sub yet. Alright, looking at this, I'm doing 1018 by 24s. If I look at my info tab, it'll tell you how it's breaking down. My live size, which live size means plus any margins. Meaning if I'm doing 18 by 24, but I need a 2-inch margin all the way around it, that's going to add 4 inches to my live size in either direction, the actual material used. Whether it needs to flip it, it's best utilized if it rotates it so that 24 is height and 18 is width, so it knows to flip it. Paneling, if it's bigger than the material, it will have to panel it. And it knows I can fit 5 by 2 to get my 10. Printed area, scrap area, total area, and roll length. Now this is including of my printer, any lead in and lead out materials that I said, as well as it knows how many it can fit up and down based off the gaps, the margins on the top and bottom. Now looking at this, in my parts that I had set up, here's my calendared vinyl. It's using 7.5 feet, and it's using my MutoJet 0.55 hours. Now, if I had changed my labor from 100%, this would be a percentage of that. The Muto is still set at 100% labor. My print ink is 30 square feet and at that cost. Again, it could also be altered based off of my resolution. Because if I increase my resolution, my print time is also going to go up as it slows down. Therefore, in a cost-based pricing, my price would also go up, all based on labor. Now, if I had a white ink, if I added an alternate print mode, it would show up here as a checkbox that says I need white ink, and it would flip that to the speeds when printing white ink. Alright, now all we've done so far is pull these materials, give it an estimated cost, and mark it up to give it a price. Where I want you to focus on is this estimated usage and estimated cost. Estimated price at this point is, if you're using a cost-based pricing anyway, you're just going to run yourself in circles trying to get a price right before your estimated usage and estimated cost is right. So my focus 100% now is on costing, and then we'll get into converting these into pricing in a later session. Now, each component has a different entity to it. So if I go in and now say, I've got my vinyl, I now need to mount it. So I'm going to hand mount this. I could laminate it as well onto some Coroplast. Okay, just some 4mm white. You'll notice on my info tab, it now knows how I'm breaking out my material as well for my flat stock. So 2x5 fits perfectly, 10 up, using 1 sheet of material, and it's going to have 2 feet of scrap in that sheet. Now, one thing to note here is you'll notice my sheet usage is full sheet, meaning round to the next full sheet on material. Anything other than that thinks you're going to basically cut it before you use it and therefore not waste it. And think about it as you're putting it back into inventory. If it's Coroplast and they only order, let's say, 4 of these, right, it is still wanting to round up to the next full sheet because I told it to. The point is, do you want the client to buy the whole sheet or don't you? And on some materials that you order in very rarely or specific for them, you may want them to go up to the full sheet. I could at this time say, no, I'm just going to use a half sheet vertical, and it's going to cut the sheet in half, basically. And so now it knows I can fit a 2x2 on a half sheet, 4 up, therefore I'm only using a half sheet with 4 square feet of scrap. Both of them are always going to try to figure out scrap by default because it's an important part of cost. However, you can change it. If I go in and say it's just print area only, you'll notice that my part is going to pull 0.38 of a sheet. It's going to pull exactly the printed area and what that incorporates of the sheet using no scrap at all. Now, if I say that with my digital materials, under digital materials, you have the same option, which is print area only and a scrap factor. And then therefore, it no longer looks at how many fits up and across and lead-ins and lead-outs, etc. It just looks at, all right, how much square footage, and it's a 54-inch roll, so I'm going to divide that by 54, add a little percentage for scrap. Now, in most situations, you want to add for that waste and that scrap, in my opinion. It's a cost, it's an expense, and you may be able to lower your current thinking and your pricing as far as if you're using cost-based pricing, or you may be able to lower some of your margins if you start collecting for some of your waste. Excuse me. And that allows you to build in how much material you're going to use into each component. Now, if I now look at my parts, it's breaking down my half sheet of Coroplast, time on hand-mounted labor to mount this, my printing time, my labor time, etc. And that's coming together to give you a cost. And if I look at my costs, it's going to break it down, equipment outsourced, etc. Give you a total cost, give you a price, and this is what it thinks it's doing with its multipliers and margins to give you a price. And we'll get into that more in our next session when we talk about prices as well. But looking from that as a part factor, take a look at my flat stock. Flat stock, very similar to the roll stock materials, has almost the same value, slightly different. Now again, looking at these materials, these are the ones, and there's one probably in each category so you to clone. But if you wanted to take a shortcut, go ahead and look at all of them, and there are many, and go ahead and turn on all the ones you use and turn off the ones you don't, and then go in and edit them from there and add new ones. If that's easier for you, to start with as many of them as possible. Again, you do need to adjust your costs. We're not guaranteeing costs here. Those vary all over the country, etc. But these are all the materials that are actually in your system. They're just off by default, so they don't all get in your way. You go through and just check the ones you want. This is basically in every category. It works this way. All right, back to my estimate. Now I've got this estimate, and I'm going to go ahead and change it back to what we were looking at before, just a little bit. Go to the full sheet. Now if I needed to cut these out, I can tell it how I'm going to cut them out and what complexity. Now these are pretty square cut, meaning I don't need any gaps in the middle. It's just going to cut them out in squares, one cut between each entity. Now as you fill these out, you'll see these little question mark boxes down the right hand side. These are to explain to you what they're doing, meaning in this resolution question mark, it is going to tell you, okay, these are my different resolutions, these are my print speeds that I have set up for that printer currently. If I look at the one for the full sheet, it's going to tell you it's a quarter sheet, half sheet, what that size is. Just that. If I look at the one for cutting, this is a perimeter cut, a standard cut, simple, standard, complex, and square thinks you're just cutting it in squares. Alright. You also have finishing options. We'll get more into those in current as well to add edge hardware, treatments, etc. that you might need to do. Now what I want to do is in your system there's a company called Test Company set up by default. Before you go live, we're going to strip everything out of your system under the company Test Company, so feel free to go beat it up. Create as many orders, invoices, whatever you want for Test Company, and we will save it. Now, as you're running tests, I find it's a good idea to try to run a test on something that's familiar in your shop or may even be a current order in your shop where possible. And then I'm going to go in here and say this is test number 100255, whatever your current order is. Right? Because looking at this product, and it's showing me my parts and my usage, I'm going to save this. Now, as reference, I'm going to first save it as an estimate. You don't have to. You can skip and save it straight as an order if you'd like. But I'm going to save it as an estimate, and then you could go in and print this estimate. Now, that is not my interest today. My interest is more in the work order. So I'm going to convert this into an order. It's just asking, making sure we want to convert it into an order. Test Company is set up as a cash client, hence the reason it's asking me for a deposit. This is controlled based off your terms for company. And now I have an order that is currently in work in progress. We'll get into statuses later where you can say that it's now in shipping and printing, etc. But currently it's in work in progress. So I'm going to print a work order at this time. When printing a work order or an invoice or anything else, you get a number of options in the middle. One of them, for example, is show totals. This will actually show prices on a work order. Very few shops have any need to show production what you're selling things for. But you can if you want. One I'm interested in is show parts. So if I preview this work order, and there are different work order templates. This is one sample. You'll notice it's printing my work order, printing my information, and then my details about this particular line item. It is also printing out a bill of materials. With that bill of materials, it's giving an estimated usage and a spot for you to put actual. As I said, I wouldn't recommend trying to get cut times right away. This is how you're going to test your cut times. If I go in and I have my cut labor set to 3/8 and my cutting equipment set to 3/8, well, how long did it really take? So I recommend trying to, as you go through and tweak these and set these up, try to take the simple jobs that come in and just create a test estimate for them, an order, throw them in, print this, throw it in the job jacket with your current system, and that way both your production people can start getting used to what they're going to see come out of the system, have their feedback on it, as well as you can start tracking what your reality is compared to what we think it is in the system. And that way, by tracking this, now of course you will always have missteps. You know, if I had a head jam, and so therefore, you know, it shut printing down for 3 hours, I don't want to count that necessarily as my print time for this job. I may count it, but put a side note on it that there was a problem and it's not typical. So you don't want to use those in your calculations to come up with a good time. And that's kind of what we're doing in the next step, is just kind of looking at these costs. Now once we're comfortable with cost, we can focus more on price. All right. And that really takes us through step 1 through 5. I went through 5 quickly. I recommend you read 5 before you start working on it. And I'm just going to unmute everyone and see if you have any questions.
Unmuted.
You're unmuted unless you've muted yourself. Any questions about so far? You can also type it in the...
Rob, hey, it's Ryan. We had a meeting this morning. How you doing?
Hey, Ryan. How's everything?
Good. I was able to make it on. Hey, I got a question for you in regards to the estimates that you guys have. The content that's down at the bottom, is that, can you adjust that? I don't see you have it on here, but say you have an estimate and we have certain underlining items that we need to have on an estimate. Can we go through and change kind of what our system and our data that we need to put on there?
There's different things you can put. These default estimate notes and default invoice notes are things you want to print on every estimate.
Okay.
Okay, you can use merge fields in creating these notes as well. So an merge field is just a field out of the system. So if I say date, it's going to take the date and field, put it in that. Now that's to default something every time. In an order and estimate, you also have a notes field, and these are things you want to add on the fly.
Okay. My next question is, I saw how you did that merge data. I've gone to go email email a test estimate to someone, and say for the subject line, we typically have the estimate number and that stuff. So when I went to go do it on my end, I noticed when you were in this morning, we had a little bit of problems, and it wasn't merging that data correctly. I mean, maybe I just restart the system and redo that, but that didn't work the first time I tried doing it.
Take a look at it. Generally on the, like when you're looking at a report, you're looking at action for orders or for estimates. Now, right now I'm in setup, reporting setup. I'm a little beyond where we are in the class. But in this situation, under your options for each report, you can set up those merge fields.
Okay.
So in my email function, this 2 here, you'll see that these merge fields will work in there as well. So if I say order description, well,
yeah, see, that's
you want that in the 2. You want that in the subject line.
exactly what I did, and see how it pops up right there, and it adds that little, that content, so that way it knows to merge that information. It didn't
Correct.
do that. So maybe it just needed to be reset,
Okay, yeah, we can look at it as well later if need be.
Yeah, I'll give it another shot and see if it works. I mean, again, we had some issues with it this morning, so maybe purging everything would help with that as well.
Sounds good. Any other questions? You could type or speak them.
None.
Or anybody else? All right. So basically went through step 5. What I'd like you to do before our class is finish your company taxes and product setup. That way you can bring any questions tomorrow that need be. Again, your point person will help you with details. I want you to enter your parts, your primary parts for your wide format print product, meaning your printer, your roll stock, your flat stock, that you can, at least your most common. Not necessarily spend hours hunting down that one material you sold 3 months ago, but the ones you sell at the most common is what you want to start with. And then I want you to kind of run an estimate like I did, convert it into an order, and print a work order. And that way you've got the cycle down as well as you have something to show production. The sooner production starts looking at your changes that are coming and gets your feedback and their comfort level, you'll be happier as well, as far as from my experience. That's really it. Thanks for attending, everybody.